The Montana blizzard howled across the valley when Officer Jack Turner found the wounded German shepherd half buried in snow outside his cabin. He thought he'd rescued a stray. He had no idea the dog once belonged to a secret K-9 unit, or that saving it would drag him back into the case that destroyed his career. Stay with us to see how one man and one dog uncovered a buried truth. Like and subscribe if you believe loyalty can outlive betrayal. The wind came like a freight train without tracks, shoving drifts up against the porch steps and packing the seams of the cabin door with ice so hard it whistled. Jack Turner stood in the doorway in his thermal shirt and parka, one hand braced to keep the door from slamming, the other cupped like a visor against a sky that had disappeared. The mountain across the meadow, his usual measure for distance and weather, was gone. Everything was white and moving. Then he saw it, a thin red seam stitched across the snow from the tree line to his porch, the way a careless seamstress might run a thread across a sheet. Jack's breath clouded, paused. He listened. The storm offered the hollow roar of a shell held to a child's ear and a soft tapping somewhere near the steps. He told himself it was a loose branch. It wasn't. The tapping came again, an urgent, weak rattle against wood. Jack pushed the door open wider, and the wind shoved back scattering powdered snow across his boots and the mat that said welcome in letters he had never found the heart to remove. The blood seam widened near the steps into a sprayed constellation, and at the base of the third riser lay a black shape curled tight as a fist. Jack knelt. The cold bit through denim in a second, a clear, mean thing. He slid one gloved hand under the shape and felt ribs like piano keys and a tremor that barely counted as life. The fur was matted with ice crystals. They crunched under his palm. Two amber eyes opened a sliver and steadied on him with an eerie professional calm, as if measuring him. The shape tried to lift its head at a far-off peal, the county cruiser's siren on Highway 2 probably, but the effort died and the head flopped back against Jack's wrist. German shepherd, he thought young, too thin. He gathered the dog as if it were a child fallen asleep in the wrong room, tucked it into his parka, and shouldered the door shut with his hip. The cabin swallowed the storm. Inside, the old wood stove ticked like an anxious metronome. Jack cleared a space on the braided rug and wrapped the dog in 2 towels from the bathroom, a faded blue one, and the one he kept for muddy boots. He remembered protocols from 100 hypothermia calls and 1,000 hours of training he had never planned to use at home. Gradual warming, not too fast. No hot water. Keep the core warm limbs last. He filled a metal bowl with water that steamed just shy of hot and set it near the stove. He cranked the damper open half a turn and fed the fire 2 split sticks of lodgepole pine. The flames took like they had been waiting for their cue. Jack pressed his palm gently to the dog's chest. The heartbeat skittered, quick, irregular, scared, but it was there. He eased off his gloves and rubbed the dog's ears between his fingers to coax blood to the surface. The ears twitched. "Good. Easy," he said, voice gone hoarse from a day without speaking. "You're okay. You made it to the right porch." The dog's breath came shallow and fast, frosting his wrist. When Jack reached to straighten the wet fur at the neck, his fingertip found a thin raised line just under the coat-old scar tissue, clean and deliberate, exactly where a collar would have rubbed if someone had fitted the animal for training gear. He caught himself cataloging details the way he did at Scene's matted fur, but trimmed pads. Blunt nails, not the overgrown talons of a stray. A faint smell of antiseptic under the wet dog and iron scent of blood. Somebody had cared once. Somebody had lost track, or let go. He filled a syringe from the first aid kit with warmed electrolyte solution, and after a beat of apology to the animal and to whatever past handler had laid down their trust, slid it gently into the pouch of gum to hydrate without swamping the gut. The dog stirred, eyes sharpening for a heartbeat before clouding again. "There you go," Jack said, adjusting the towels so the heat from the stove could reach but not scorch. He moved the old recliner close enough that his knees almost kissed the hearth and sat with his forearms on his thighs, huddled over like a man warming his hands at a barrel fire in a winter no one had ordered. The storm railed and the cabin creaked. He kept watch, the way he kept watch on midnight perimeters years ago in a different life that still lived under his skin. 30 minutes an hour, time stretched thin. The dog's tremors eased to a fine vibration. Snow hissed against the window panes, then softened. The wood stove settled into its steady thrum. Jack's mind tried to go where it always went when the world got quiet, back to the parking garage and the bright instant that had split his life. But the weight of the dog on the rug, the soft sound of its breath catching and restarting kept him here. A small sound broke the room. Not a bark, not even a whine. The dog's paw edged out from the towel pads, gray and cracked from ice. Jack lifted the paw lightly. It fit across his palm with a steadiness that surprised him. The muscles quivered and relaxed. He placed the paw back inside the towel and let his hand rest an extra second, the way officers did on shoulders after bad news. "I'm here." No speeches. The cabin clock clicked to 9, then 9:05. Jack tried a half-ounce of warmed broth on a spoon. The dog refused twice, eyes shuddering, then flicked its tongue across the rim and lapped shallowly. Good. He gave it a minute, then offered a little more. Outside, the storm began to exhaust itself, its tantrum downgraded to a sulk. Jack's radio, hung on a peg by the door out of habit rather than need, barked a burst of static and a distant call for any unit near mile marker 27. He considered keying up to offer help, old reflex, but the sound made the dog's ears twitch. The eyes opened clearer now, and the head lifted a fraction. There it was again, that professional calm, the kind you saw in the eyes of partners who had decided they were going to get through a shift no matter what the city threw. "You hear that?" Jack asked softly. "You know the song?" The dog didn't answer, of course. But when a gust shoved a little snow down the chimney and the stove popped and the room blinked with the memory of a flash he refused to name. The dog's head slid forward until it bumped the heel of Jack's boot. The touch was light, almost accidental. Jack left his foot there. He'd been a city cop long enough to know you don't name things the first night. Don't borrow trouble. Don't promise tomorrow to a life you might not be able to keep. Still, a name occurred to him and hung back patient. He pushed it aside. The wind dropped again. In the kind of quiet that only comes after fury has burned through, he studied the animal. The coat was a deep, clean black that threw blue when the fire leaned a certain way. The muzzle carried a dusting of gray from frost, not age. The eyes, when they opened, were amber with a dark ring at the edge of each iris, like a target seen from a respectful distance. A ridge of muscle ran down the shoulders, even under the malnourishment. Not a stray's slouch, a trained dog's posture gone thin from time outdoors, and not enough calories. This wasn't some backyard escapee, and that scar at the neck, he couldn't stop seeing the line of it under his thumb. Jack rose, careful not to let the towels slide, and crossed to the kitchen. He warmed a little more broth, added a pinch of salt for electrolytes, stirred until the surface steamed and the scent drifted back toward the hearth. He placed the bowl near the dog's nose and waited. The tongue came out, tasted, committed. Jack exhaled. His chest felt less like a fist. "All right," he murmured. "All right, partner. You keep that down and we'll call it a win." He went to the hall closet and pulled out the thick wool blanket he'd kept since academy days, the one with a burn mark that looked like a small continent. He spread it under the towels, an extra layer against the floor's seeping cold, then set a pot of water on the stove's back burner to humidify the air. He was aware as he moved through these simple tasks that the cabin felt different. Not louder, not brighter, just inhabited in a way that didn't demand he tell the ghosts where to sit. The dog finished the broth and settled, breath slower now, the kind of breathing you believed in. Jack sat again and let the night pass through its stations, the last frantic flurries. the tired wind, the final sigh of branches shedding their burden to the ground. Toward 3 in the morning, the dog shifted and tucked itself tighter, a motion that spoke less of fear than of the body remembering what to do when the cold tried to write its ending. Jack leaned forward and, without thinking too hard about meaning, set his hand on the dog's neck. The fur was drying, warming. He felt the steady thud beneath. He pictured absurdly the morning calling Dr. Linda Hayes as soon as the road was passable, asking her to scan for a chip, buying proper food from the feed store down on Pine, locating a crate he'd told himself he would never need. The list calmed him the way lists always had doable things to cross off with a pen, a way to shape a day that might otherwise spill all over the floor. The storm outside fell to a hush, broken only by the occasional soft collapses of roof snow slipping to the ground. Dawn would be a smudge before it was a color. He let his eyes close just for a breath and opened them when the dog's paw nudged his boot again. "I'm here," he said, not sure which of them he was reassuring. "You made it to the right porch." He let the cabin be quiet, and he let the quiet not hurt. Somewhere past the trees, the highway would be a slow line of plows and hazard lights. Here a man and a dog shared heat and breath and the beginning of something that didn't need a name yet. Outside, the storm gave up. Inside, the stove whispered old stories, and the dog slept the kind of sleep that means you've chosen to stay. By the time the first color touched the edge of the sky, the storm had folded itself into silence. Jack Turner opened the cabin door cautiously, testing the world as though it might still bite. The air was sharp but clear. The trees stood burdened and still, the snow layered so high the steps looked carved from marble. He set the coffee pot on the stove, the smell of dark roast cutting through the smell of cold ash. On the rug by the hearth, the black shepherd lifted its head, the movement slow but steady. "Good morning, soldier," Jack said quietly. The dog blinked once, almost in acknowledgement. He poured a little water into a bowl, then half a cup of chicken broth and placed it near the dog's muzzle. It drank in slow, deliberate swallows, pausing to breathe as if pacing itself. That was progress. He would take progress. The roads would be open by mid-morning if the county plows kept their schedule. Jack wrapped the dog in the wool blanket, carried it to his truck, and settled it on the passenger seat where it curled silent and alert. The drive to town was cautious, tires whispering on packed snow. The town of Red Valley looked like a photograph someone had left too long in the sun. Faded storefronts, a flag half frozen on the pole in front of the sheriff's office, and Dr. Linda Hayes' small clinic tucked beside the diner. She met him at the door, still tying her white coat. "You picked a fine day to drive, Officer Turner," she said with a tired smile. "What have you got there?" Jack unfolded the blanket and the dog lifted its head. Linda's practiced eyes softened. "German Shepherd," she said, running a gloved hand down its spine. "About a year-old male, severely dehydrated but otherwise sound. He's got the posture of a trained dog, probably worked K-9 or private security." She paused, checking the neck. "See this? That's where a training collar rubbed. And here, surgical scar. Someone removed his tracking chip." Jack frowned. Intentionally, she nodded. "Clean cut, not wild at all. My guess, lost in transit, maybe deserted during relocation. Poor thing's been out there a while." She injected fluids, checked vitals, and wrote down notes in looping handwriting. "He'll live," she said. "You did well bringing him in." Jack felt something unclench in his chest. "No claim reports." "Not in the last year," she said, glancing at her computer. "If he was federal or military, the records wouldn't show here. You can post a notice, but I doubt anyone's looking." She reached into a cabinet, pulled out antibiotics, and handed him a small paper bag. "Twice a day. He'll need soft food for a week. Keep him warm. And if you plan to keep him, come back for shots." Jack nodded, hesitated. "What do I call him?" Linda smiled, tapping the clipboard. He looks like a Rex to me. Strong name for a survivor. On the way home, the name rolled around Jack's mind until it fit. The dog Rex sat upright now, watching the passing snowfields with a steady gaze. At one point, he leaned forward, nose close to the windshield, ears pricked as if cataloging scents, even through glass. "You've done this before," Jack murmured. The drive took longer uphill. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had dipped low enough to paint the snow with gold that faded almost instantly into blue. Jack carried Rex inside, set the blanket near the stove again, and laid out the antibiotics on the counter beside the coffee mug he had abandoned the night before. The routine steadied him. He fed Rex spoonfuls of soft food until the dog turned away full. Then Jack sat on the floor nearby, his back against the couch, half watching the fire, half listening to the rhythm of breathing that no longer sounded fragile. As the evening deepened, shadows gathered in the corners of the room. He let his eyes close for a moment, only to feel the pull of the old nightmare, the garage, the flash, the heat that had swallowed his partner's shout. He jerked awake, heart pounding. The cabin was still, but his pulse carried the weight of memory. Then a soft pressure touched his chest. Rex stood beside him, one paw resting lightly on his shirt, eyes fixed on his face, calm and steady. The contact was enough to pull Jack back into the room. "Easy," he whispered, voice rough. "It's okay." The dog didn't move, only kept that quiet, watchful stance until Jack's breathing evened. Then Rex lay down again, head near Jack's knee. Jack sat for a long while, hand resting on the coarse fur, feeling the warmth spread from that small point of connection outward. He had told himself for months that solitude was safety, that silence was peace. Yet the sound of the dog's steady breathing made the cabin feel less like a bunker and more like shelter. Near midnight, the stove's last log burned down to coals. Jack added 2 more pieces, the glow flickering across the walls. Rex shifted closer, curling into a shape that fit the space perfectly, as if the dog had already mapped the boundaries of this temporary home. Jack whispered almost to himself, "Guess you're staying the night." He thought about the scar on the neck, the calmness during treatment, the way the dog had woken at the radio's static earlier. Trained, disciplined. Somebody had taught this animal to save lives, not beg for them. Who would leave that kind of loyalty in the snow? The question turned over in his mind until sleep took him again. This time, when the memories started to creep in, a low sound reached him, soft, rhythmic breathing beside the bed. It anchored him. He drifted deeper, not into the garage, not into fire, but into the steady hush of winter against the cabin walls. For the first time in almost a year, he slept through to dawn. When light edged through the window, Rex was awake, sitting quietly by the door, watching the trees as if waiting for orders. Jack rubbed his eyes, disoriented by the strange feeling of rest. "Morning, Rex," he said, testing the name out loud. The dog's ears flicked at the sound. "Yeah, that's you." He rose, stretched, and for a moment allowed himself to believe the day might be ordinary. But outside, a set of unfamiliar tire tracks curved up the drive, ending just beyond the mailbox. Someone had been there while he slept. He looked back at Rex, who was already standing alert, tail low, eyes locked on the same direction. The calm of the morning thinned into unease, and Jack knew the quiet wouldn't last long. Morning came clean and cold sunlight, sharp as glass over the snow. Jack Turner moved through the quiet rhythm of habit, feeding Rex, making coffee, checking the generator. The dog followed each motion with alert precision, not intrusive but observant, learning him the way a new partner would learn a shift pattern. The cabin felt smaller but not cramped alive now, with sound the click of Rex's claws on the floorboards, the low sigh when the dog settled near the stove. Jack wasn't used to company. He had spent months convincing himself that solitude was a form of control, but it turned out silence could be heavier than noise. When he spoke to Rex, the words didn't echo. They landed. By the third day, the dog responded to his tone with uncanny speed. "Sit," Jack said once more out of instinct than command. Rex folded into a sit before the word finished leaving his mouth. "Stay," and the dog froze. Heel and he moved exactly to Jack's left side, matching pace as if rehearsed. Jack stood there for a long moment, the morning breath clouding around them. "You've done this before," he murmured. Rex tilted his head as though trying to remember where. Over the next week, the rhythm between them settled into something steady. Jack's days became marked by Rex's needs. Walks along the logging road, feeding times the small rituals of maintenance that pulled him out of his own head. The nightmares still came, but softer now, and sometimes he woke with Rex's paw resting lightly on his arm, a quiet reassurance that the present was still holding. On the 8th morning, Jack took Rex out along the forest edge for the first real patrol he'd done in months. It wasn't official work, just habit-checking property lines, making sure no one had trespassed or dumped trash in the woods. The air carried the damp sweetness of thawing pine needles under snow. Rex trotted ahead, tail-level ears scanning like radar dishes. Jack whistled once to keep him close. The dog obeyed instantly, returning to heel. A bird startled from a branch and the snow cascaded down in a glittering curtain. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt his shoulders ease. They reached the old service trail that led down toward the creek. The storm had carved strange shapes into the drifts, and the trees bent under their own weight. Jack paused to catch his breath and to watch Rex exploring. The dog's nose traced the air, sudden tension running through his frame. Then he broke into a sprint downhill, snow spraying behind him. "Rex, heel." Jack called sharp and automatic, but Rex didn't stop. The voice that would have frozen any city K9 in its tracks barely slowed him. Jack swore under his breath at himself, not the dog, and pushed down the slope, boots sinking deep. Rex had reached the base of an old pine and was digging furiously, snow and dirt flying in frantic rhythm. Jack waited close, heart pounding, half angry, half worried, until a metallic clang cut through the sound of scraping claws. The dog froze, then backed up, chest-heaving, eyes locked on the dark object now exposed. Jack knelt beside him and brushed away the rest of the snow. What lay there looked like a small brick wrapped in mud, rusted, dented, but unmistakable. A police-issue handheld radio, the kind used before digital systems took over. Jack turned it in his gloved hands, reading the faint lettering worn nearly smooth. Model 560C. He had carried the same type during his years in Metro Division. He pressed the transmit key out of habit, but the speaker only hissed with static. The battery had long since died. He flipped open the back panel and saw a faded label with the unit frequency 412B, his old precinct's channel. The snow pressed in around him like a held breath. "Where'd you find this?" he asked quietly, though the answer sat right in front of him. Rex whined once, low, impatient tail stirring snow. "Good boy," Jack said the words automatic. "Show me." The dog nosed the dirt, sniffed again, then sat down, eyes fixed on him as if expecting a next step. Jack stared at the radio. He hadn't thought about that frequency in nearly a year. The department had switched systems right after the explosion, and the gear from his old unit had been recalled, logged, destroyed. This one shouldn't exist. He slipped the radio into a plastic evidence bag from the pocket of his parka, old habits, survived even retirement, and zipped it shut. The bag fogged immediately from the cold. As they climbed back toward the cabin, Rex stayed close, occasionally glancing up as though reading Jack's mood. "You've got good instincts," Jack said. "But we need to talk about running off like that." The reprimand was gentle, more ritual than anger. Rex accepted it, ears flattening for a moment before resuming his steady trot. Back at the cabin, Jack cleaned the device carefully, the smell of rust and oil mingling with coffee. Under the grime, the serial number emerged 23-714. He wrote it down on the back of an envelope. When he powered up his old laptop and searched the number in archived maintenance records, The screen hesitated before returning a single line of data property of Metro Precinct evidence storage destroyed after incident number 1487. The incident number matched the explosion that had ended his partner's life. Jack leaned back, staring at the dog curled beside the fire. Rex looked up, head tilted again, that same steady gaze. "You were trained to find things," Jack said softly. "Guess you still are." He placed the radio on the mantel where the light caught its dull metal. It sat there like an uninvited memory, humming with questions. As dusk fell, snow began again, light and slow. Jack poured a small measure of water into Rex's bowl and watched him drink. His mind kept circling the same thought, how a dog that shouldn't have been his had led him straight back to the moment he'd been trying to bury. The coincidence felt too sharp, too precise. He didn't believe in signs, but he did believe in patterns, and this one had his fingerprints all over it. The fire crackled. Rex lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked toward the window. A truck engine sounded far off on the road, then faded. Jack stood still, listening. Nothing but the wind. He turned back, but the unease lingered like static in his chest. He reached down to pat the dog's head. "You and me, Rex," he said quietly. "We'll figure it out." Rex pressed his head against Jack's knee, silent agreement. Outside, the new snow covered the old footprints, erasing the trail as if the day hadn't happened. But inside the cabin, on the mantel above the fire, the old radio waited a piece of the past that refused to stay buried. Jack Turner sat at the kitchen table, the dull gray of the morning pressing against the frosted windows. The old police radio lay on the table between his hands, cleaned now, but the rust still carried the color of dried blood. A cup of coffee cooled beside it, forgotten. He had spent half the night running the serial number through every accessible database he still had credentials for, but most of the screens had blinked back restricted access. He'd expected that. What he hadn't expected was the number that finally matched. The serial etched into the metal plate 237014 belonged to a unit officially destroyed in connection with Case 1487. The case. His case. The one that ended in a flash of light and concrete dust, and the sound of his partner Mike shouting something Jack never heard clearly over the explosion. Jack read the record again, fingers tightening around the mouse. Destroyed after investigation, closed, the document said. Closed. That single word had followed him for months, printed on every report he'd tried to reopen, stamped over every request for access. It wasn't just a reminder that the department had moved on, it was a warning to stop asking. Now the proof sat on his table, an object that shouldn't exist. He reached for his notebook, flipped to a clean page, and wrote the serial number, date, found location, and one word: impossible. Rex lay under the window, watching him, the dog's ears occasionally flicking at sounds only he could hear. Jack looked down at him. "You found something, didn't you?" "Something they missed." Rex blinked, head resting on his paws, content but alert. Jack remembered how the dog had dug, not like an animal chasing scent, but like a trained partner following procedure. Maybe instinct, maybe memory. Either way, the discovery had pulled the past back into the room. He opened the drawer, pulled out the old USB stick he'd kept hidden among receipts and service patches. Inside it were copies of the case files he'd managed to save before being forced to turn in his badge. He connected it to the laptop, scrolled to the evidence inventory. Line 47, radio model 560C, serial 237014, recovered near vehicle debris, tested for explosive residue. He stopped reading there, the breath leaving him slow. He remembered the day they found it. The radio had been bent nearly in half, the casing blackened from heat. Forensics had ruled it unusable. He had handed it to evidence himself, signed it out with his own initials. Now it was here again, a ghost in metal. The thought settled over him like cold ash. Someone had pulled it from storage, someone with clearance, someone who wanted it gone. He rubbed his thumb over the serial once more, then closed the laptop and leaned back. Rex lifted his head, ears pricked toward the door. "Relax," Jack said automatically. But he felt it too, a faint hum in the floorboards, the low vibration of an approaching engine. The sound grew, then faded as a vehicle slowed on the road outside. Jack stood, walked to the window. Through the glass between the skeletal trees, he saw it a black SUV moving slowly past the cabin. No lights, windows tinted. Not a neighbor's truck. It rolled by without stopping, but the deliberate pace made his stomach tighten. Rex stood now, every muscle tense, a low rumble rising from his chest. Jack put a hand on the dog's collar. "Easy," he whispered, but Rex's gaze stayed fixed on the road. The SUV disappeared around the bend. Jack waited, counting seconds. 10, 20. The silence returned, heavy and familiar. He exhaled and forced himself to move to act, not freeze. He wrote the time in his notebook, then stepped outside, the cold biting at his face. The only sign of the vehicle was a pair of tire tracks, fresh and deep. He followed them to where they merged back into the main road, disappearing toward town. The wind carried nothing but the faint smell of exhaust. Back inside, Rex paced the room, restless. Jack poured another coffee, hand steady only because they'd been trained to be. The SUV could be nothing. Hunters, surveyors, lost travelers. But something in the controlled speed, the deliberate way it had passed, suggested otherwise. He couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, the old instinct that had saved him too many times in alleys and stairwells. That night, after sunset, he turned on his computer again and opened a law enforcement network he wasn't technically authorized to access anymore. It took him 10 minutes to find the right form and another 5 to run the partial plate number he'd memorized. The system hesitated, then returned a registration, Black Crown Security, Missoula, Montana. The name sparked recognition. They were a private contractor, one of the firms that had cleaned up and cataloged evidence after the explosion. Their reports had all been signed off by one officer, Lieutenant Harris. Jack leaned back, staring at the screen until the glow blurred. Harris had been his commanding officer, the man who ordered him to stand down when he insisted on re-examining the blast scene. Harris had called it an accident, a faulty detonation. When Jack protested, he'd been offered early leave. He had taken it because the alternative was worse. Now, a company tied to Harris had a vehicle outside his house the same night he found a piece of evidence linked to that very case. Coincidence was a word for people who hadn't seen the inside of a report room. Jack closed the laptop and set it aside. The fire had burned low shadows crowding the corners. Rex had settled again, but every so often his ears twitched toward the window. Jack rose, added wood to the stove, and checked the latch on the door twice. He told himself it was routine. The night stretched long, full of small sounds, the creak of cooling beams, the sigh of snow slipping from the roof, the dog's steady breathing. He couldn't sleep. The image of the radio on the table kept pulling him back. He tried to think logically, step by step. Someone had accessed sealed evidence, destroyed the records, and left the item where a trained K9 would find it. Either a message or a mistake. Both were dangerous. Near midnight, headlights flickered far down the road, just a flash between trees. Jack's hand went automatically to the revolver on the side table. The lights didn't return. Still, he stayed awake until the first gray hint of dawn leaked through the window. When he finally rose, the world outside was blanketed again, new snow covering the tire marks from the night before, erased like everything else tied to that case. Rex sat by the door, waiting, calm but watchful. Jack poured coffee and looked at the radio still sitting on the mantel. He didn't touch it. "Looks like we've got company," he said quietly. Rex's tail moved once, a restrained acknowledgement. Jack glanced towards the road again. The snow clean undisturbed, but he knew the stillness was temporary. The past was moving again, and it had found his address. The morning after the black SUV sighting, Jack Turner could not shake the unease that clung to him like frost. Every noise in the woods, every hum from the stove sounded heavier, more deliberate. He tried to fall into routine, but the act felt forced. Rex stayed close, his movement slower. Deliberate head always tilted toward the windows as though expecting a return. Jack checked the locks twice before leaving for supplies. The road to town was empty, the sky low and pale. He filled the truck with gas, bought food and a new padlock for the shed, and exchanged brief words with the clerk, who knew enough not to ask questions. When he returned, the cabin was exactly as he had left it, neat, quiet, undisturbed. Rex met him at the door, tail low but steady. Jack knelt, rubbing the dog's ears. "Good boy," he said softly. "It's just us now." That evening, snow began again, a thin veil drifting sideways across the window. Jack sat at the table, cleaning the revolver he kept more for habit than need, though he found himself checking the chambers twice. Rex lay near the door, half asleep, yet every so often his ears flicked toward the wind, as though hearing something inside it. Around midnight, the power flickered once, then steadied. The sudden shift of light made Jack look up. Rex was already on his feet, muscles taut. "What is it?" Jack whispered, setting the revolver down. The dog growled, a low, steady sound that vibrated against the floorboards. Then Jack heard it too, the faint scrape of metal on wood, a deliberate movement at the back door. He rose silently, motion honed by years of training, and moved toward the noise. Another sound followed, the subtle creak of hinges shifting under weight. The back latch was being tested. Jack reached for the revolver, checked the safety, and positioned himself behind the wall near the doorway. Rex stood beside him, body rigid, gaze fixed. The latch gave with a soft click. The door opened a fraction. A gloved hand slipped through the gap. Before Jack could move, Rex launched forward. The impact of dog against intruder broke the silence like a gunshot. The man stumbled into the kitchen, his mask catching on the doorframe as Rex hit again, jaws clamping on the arm that held the crowbar. The man cried out, tried to wrench free, but Rex twisted his weight perfectly, forcing him down, pinning the arm. Jack stepped in, revolver raised. "Stop!" he shouted, the old authority in his voice, sharp and familiar. The man kicked backward, catching Jack in the knee just enough to break his balance. The crowbar clattered across the floor. Rex held tight, growling deep. Then the man pulled a small canister from his belt and sprayed. The bitter chemical stung Jack's eyes and filled the room with smoke. Rex coughed, loosened his grip for half a second, just enough. The intruder rolled free, crashed through the side door, and vanished into the storm. Jack stumbled after him, the revolver heavy in his grip, but by the time he reached the clearing, the darkness had already swallowed the man. Tire tracks cut into the snow near the trees, leading back toward the road. Jack lowered the gun slowly. Behind him, Rex limped into view, shaking off the residue from the spray. Jack knelt beside him, checking for injuries. "You're all right," he murmured, though the words were meant for both of them. He led Rex back inside, shut the door, and barred it with a heavy plank. The kitchen smelled of metal and cold. On the floor near the crowbar, something small glinted under the table. Jack picked it up, a laminated access card half cracked from the scuffle. It bore a blue seal with an eagle and 3 letters that froze his breath: FSB, Federal Security Bureau. He stared at it, unable to believe. Whoever had come into his home had federal clearance. He set the card down carefully as though it might explode. Rex lay on the rug, licking his paw eyes, following Jack's every movement. "You knew before I did," Jack said quietly. "You were trained for this." The realization came slow but certain. No ordinary dog moved like that. No civilian pet executed controlled strikes and releases without hesitation. Rex had fought exactly as Jack's old canine partner once had, measured, efficient, loyal to the point of pain. He rubbed the dog's head. "Good job, partner." Later, when the adrenaline ebbed, Jack called someone he hadn't spoken to in months. Captain Ross answered on the second ring, his voice the same blend of calm and fatigue it had always been. "Jack Turner," Ross said. "I thought you dropped off the grid." "I did," Jack replied. Listen, I need to ask you something. You ever heard of FSB running field ops in Montana? There was a pause on the line, longer than comfort allowed. Why, Ross asked, finally. Jack explained brief and clean the SUV, the old radio, the intruder, the badge. When he finished, the silence was heavy. Then Ross said quietly, "You need to let it go." "You think this is random?" "No," Ross said. "And that's exactly why you need to stop. You don't know what you're standing in." "It's tied to the case," Jack said. "The radio was evidence. Someone wanted it buried." "Then bury it again," Ross replied. "For your own sake. You remember Harris? He's not the kind of man who leaves loose ends. If he's involved, you're not chasing truth, you're stepping into classified territory." Jack looked at the access card glinting under the lamplight. "They already stepped into my home." Ross sighed. "Then you get out. Pack up. Leave tonight." "You know I can't do that," Jack said. "Not yet." Jack Ross said, the weight of friendship in his tone. "I mean this walk away. I can't protect you if this goes where I think it's going." The line went dead a moment later, leaving the static to fill the space between heartbeats. Jack set the phone down slowly, then checked the locks again, though he knew it wouldn't matter. Whoever had come could come again. He moved to the window. Outside, the snow had stopped the forest still and listening. Rex sat beside him, silent eyes reflecting the faint light. "We're in it now," Jack said softly. The dog didn't move, only kept his gaze on the darkness beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, the intruder was gone, but not finished. Jack could feel it in the quiet, the sense of something waiting to return. 2 days after the break-in, Jack Turner began to move through his cabin like a man living inside a thin layer of glass, careful not to make a sound that might break it. He cleaned the mess left from the struggle, fixed the door, and sealed every latch. Yet he knew those gestures were more ritual than protection. Whoever had come knew how to move unseen, and how to disappear. He spent hours replaying the fight in his mind, trying to picture the intruder's build, his stance, his training. Nothing ordinary. The movements had been quick, practiced, tactical. That and the FSB card made the air in the cabin feel colder. Rex stayed close to him, more alert than usual, ears flicking at the smallest sound, eyes following every movement Jack made. The dog seemed to sense the weight of what lingered in the air. When Jack opened the door that morning, the wind carried a smell of wet bark and thawing earth. The snow had started to soften thin crust, giving way to slush beneath the boots. "We need air," Jack murmured. "Come on, partner." He clipped the lead loosely to Rex's collar and headed toward the trail behind the cabin. The forest was quiet in that deep, listening way it gets before spring, the silence filled with slow drips and the distant knock of a woodpecker. Jack moved in steady rhythm, the kind that used to calm him during long patrols. The woods had a way of scrubbing noise out of the mind. Rex trotted slightly ahead, nose down, tail level, scanning scents. Jack watched the pattern of his movement and saw once again the unmistakable discipline, controlled range, constant awareness, never straying out of line of sight. Trained. Always trained. They followed the creek for a mile until the trees opened into a clearing. Jack stopped, resting his hand on a fallen log to catch his breath. That was when the sound came, a heavy shuffle of weight breaking through underbrush to his left. Rex froze, body snapping upright, head turning toward the sound. Jack followed his gaze and felt his stomach drop. Out from between the trees emerged a large brown bear, the fur matted from melted snow, eyes small and unblinking. The animal's size filled the clearing, massive shoulders rolling with each slow step. Jack knew better than to move fast. He had dealt with bears before during search and rescue rotations, but never at this range, never without backup. He slowly lifted his hand toward his belt, though he knew the revolver would be more invitation than defense. "Easy now," he whispered. Rex took one step forward and placed himself directly between Jack and the bear. The dog did not bark or growl. He simply stood solid, unmoving, his head low, eyes locked. Jack watched in disbelief as the bear stopped. The silence between them stretched taut, the only sound the faint hiss of melting snow dripping from branches. Then, without a sound, the bear shifted its weight backward, turned and lumbered away, vanishing into the trees. Jack exhaled slowly, the air shaking from his lungs. He dropped to a knee beside Rex, who remained still for another heartbeat before relaxing. Jack's hand trembled as he rubbed the dog's neck. "You just stared down a bear," he said quietly. "Didn't even bark." The dog leaned slightly against him, accepting the touch, then shook himself once, sending droplets of meltwater into the air. They stood there until Jack's pulse calmed. When they finally returned to the cabin, the afternoon light had faded into the soft gray of approaching snow. Jack hung his coat, set the revolver on the counter, and crouched to unclip Rex's collar. That was when he saw it, a thin, raised line running down the dog's chest, barely visible under the thick black fur. He parted the coat gently, the skin beneath showing a pale scar several inches long, clean and deliberate. Not a wound from the forest. A surgical mark. Jack frowned, tracing it with a careful finger. The scar was old enough to have healed flat, but fresh enough that the fur had not fully grown back. He had seen incisions like that before, done for implanting chips or removing them. "What happened to you?" he murmured. Rex stood still, eyes steady as if he understood the question. Jack fetched a small flashlight from his desk, knelt again, and examined closer. The edges were neat, not torn. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were cutting for. He checked for stitches. None. Whoever had closed it used surgical adhesive, the kind employed by military field medics or private labs. The thought turned his stomach cold. He reached for the small handheld scanner Linda Hayes had given him weeks ago to check for identification chips. He ran it over Rex's shoulder blades, the usual place for implants. Nothing. He tried the neck, the back, the scar. The screen stayed blank. No chip. Someone had inserted something once, then gone back in to take it out. He sat back on his heels, staring at the dog, who looked perfectly calm, perfectly ordinary in every way except for the calmness itself. "You were off the grid before I found you," Jack said. "Someone wanted you invisible." He leaned back against the wall, the scar now a new piece of the puzzle that refused to fit. The pattern was clearer but darker. A trained dog with erased records, a destroyed evidence tag, a federal intruder, a company linked to Harris, and now a surgical scar where a tracker should be. Rex stretched out beside him, head resting on Jack's knee, the warmth of his weight grounding him. Jack let his hand rest on the dog's shoulder. The steady rise and fall of breathing eased something inside him. Still, the questions crowded close. Who had trained Rex? Why erase him from every system? Why send a man with clearance to retrieve an old radio that had supposedly been destroyed? The wind picked up outside, whistling through the chimney. The fire cracked softly. Jack closed his eyes and saw the bear again the way it had stopped, how Rex had stood silent but unflinching. There was no fear, only recognition, like one predator acknowledging another. He thought about that calm, about how it mirrored the control of a K-9 unit under command. Whoever had trained Rex had done so under intense discipline, and someone had tried to erase that connection completely. He rose, took his notebook from the table, and wrote 3 words under the previous entry. Erased. Purposeful. Dangerous. Then he underlined them. Outside, the forest shifted under the night wind. He turned off the lights, checked the locks again, and sat by the fire. Rex slept curled beside him, the scar now hidden under the fur, again a secret that refused to stay buried. Jack stared at the flames and whispered into the quiet, "Whatever you were, we'll find out." The fire popped, sending a spark into the air. The wind outside answered with a soft moan, and somewhere in the distance, something moved through the trees, a reminder that the woods still watched. Jack Turner sat at his desk the next morning, the notebook open, yesterday's discoveries spread out like pieces of an unfinished puzzle. The scar on Rex's chest, the erased chip, the missing records. All of it pointed somewhere he didn't want to go but could no longer avoid. Outside, snowmelt dripped from the eaves, a soft rhythm that did little to quiet the noise in his mind. Rex slept near the door, stretched long and peaceful. Yet even in rest, his ears twitched to every sound. Jack reached for his phone, stared at the contact list, and hesitated on one name he hadn't used in nearly a year. Samantha Cooper, record liaison for the Metro Bureau, and one of the few still willing to talk to him after his resignation. He dialed. The call clicked through 2 tones before her voice came wary but warm. "Jack Turner. I was wondering when I'd hear from you again." "You always said curiosity was a bad habit," he replied. "Depends on what you're curious about," she said. "What do you need?" Jack took a slow breath. "I found something. A K9 unit, possibly decommissioned name, might have been Rex. Black German Shepherd, about a year old. I need to know if there was ever a dog with that designation." There was a pause followed by the clicking of keys. "We're not supposed to release K9 data outside active law enforcement," she said. "I'm not asking for official files," Jack said softly. "Just tell me if the name exists." Another pause, longer this time. "You always pick the strange ones," she murmured. "Hold on." The faint sound of typing continued for nearly a minute before she spoke again, her voice quieter. "There's a record. K9 Rex 47 assigned to Internal Operations Task Group. Unit specialized in internal evidence retrieval, meaning they handled sensitive materials when corruption cases were involved. That's as far as I can see from this side." Jack leaned forward. "When was he last active?" "Give me a second," she said. More typing, then silence. When she spoke again, the tone had shifted. "Last logged on duty March 14th, the same date as Incident 1487. The words hit like a pulse of cold through Jack's chest. "That's the explosion," he said. "My explosion." "Yes," Samantha replied softly. "It lists Rex 47 as missing in action, presumed dead. No remains recovered." Jack stared at the sleeping dog across the room. "Who was the program lead? I don't think I should." "Sam?" Jack interrupted, voice low but steady. "Please." Another sigh, another pause. "Program Overseer Lieutenant Daniel Harris. Project authorized under the Bureau's Joint Security Initiative. That's all I can tell you. The rest is classified." Jack's grip on the phone tightened. "You did enough," he said quietly. "Thank you, Jack," she said, her voice softer now. "If you're thinking of digging into this, don't. Harris isn't just any name on a form. People who question his projects tend to end up reassigned or worse. You're out and you should stay that way." "I'll be careful," Jack said, though he knew the words sounded hollow. He ended the call and sat back, the phone heavy in his hand. The room felt smaller, as if the truth itself had taken up space. Rex stirred, lifted his head, and looked at him. "Rex 47. Jack said aloud. The dog's ears flicked at the sound, an involuntary reaction. Jack felt something shift inside him. He walked over, knelt beside the animal, and ran his hand along the scar again. "That's your number, isn't it? You were part of something they wanted gone." Rex leaned his head into Jack's palm, a gesture simple yet full of unspoken recognition. The weight of realization pressed harder with every detail. Rex 47 missing the day of the explosion, the same day Jack lost his partner, the same day the department had closed the file too quickly under Harris's signature. The connection wasn't coincidence, it was architecture. Jack rose and went to the window, looking out at the gray world beyond. Snow melted in streaks down the glass, blurring the line between forest and sky. He thought of Harris the way the man had always spoken in clipped sentences, as though every word came from a place above conscience. Harris had pushed for the task force convinced command that internal corruption needed its own watchdog. He had argued that machines couldn't detect intent, but dogs could. Now it seemed that one of those dogs had survived and had found its way back to the one person still haunted by that night. Jack returned to the desk and reopened his notebook. Under the last entry, he wrote a new line, Rex 47 Internal Ops Task Group. Missing same day as 1487. Harris. He stared at the words until they blurred. The heater clicked off, leaving the cabin wrapped in a silence that felt almost expectant. The memories came unbidden, the echo of the explosion, the ringing in his ears, the smoke curling upward while debris rained down. He had assumed everything had been destroyed, including the evidence. But if Rex had been there, then maybe not everything had burned. Maybe someone had saved the dog and erased him later when questions started to surface. He turned toward Rex, who was now standing by the door, tail steady waiting. "You were there, weren't you?" Jack whispered. "You saw what happened." The dog didn't move, only held his gaze. For a moment, Jack felt the world tilt, the weight of what he didn't yet know, pressing against what he feared was true. He picked up the old police radio from the shelf, turned it over in his hands, and felt the rough edge where the serial plate had been scratched. It matched the exact pattern of other radios issued to the Internal Ops Task Group. Rex had found it for a reason. "You brought it back," Jack said. "You're telling me something." He placed the radio beside the notebook, the two artifacts now side by side like bookends to a past that refused to close. Outside, a crow called, once distant and sharp. Jack glanced toward the trees and felt the faint tremor of a decision forming. If Harris had overseen the program, and the program's evidence had been destroyed the same day as his partner's death, then someone had silenced more than one voice that day. The truth wasn't gone. It was buried, and somehow Rex had dug it up again. Jack rubbed the dog's neck, the scar under his fingers, a reminder that survival often carried its own scars. "All right, partner," he said quietly. "We find the rest." The fire had burned down to coals, but Jack didn't add wood. The dim light suited the thought forming in his mind. Tomorrow he would drive to the city, to the one place still holding Harris's trail. The past was no longer content to stay buried. It had claws, and it had found its way home. Jack Turner woke early to the sound of tires grinding against snow outside the cabin. He stood by the window, half expecting another black SUV. Instead, a government sedan idled in the driveway, its paint dulled by road salt antenna whips flexing in the cold wind. Two men stepped out wearing heavy coats and identical expressions. They moved with the measured confidence of people who knew their authority didn't need announcement. Jack opened the door before they could knock. "Can I help you?" he asked evenly. The taller man produced an identification wallet and flipped it open long enough for Jack to glimpse a federal emblem. "Special Agent Cole," he said. "This is Agent Myers. We're with the Bureau's Security Division." The shorter one nodded, his eyes scanning the room behind Jack as if cataloging it. "We're here about an asset you're harboring," Cole continued. "A canine black German Shepherd, tag number 47. Jack's heartbeat slowed to that familiar rhythm it found whenever something dangerous came disguised as procedure. "You mean my dog," he said. "Rex." "The animal in question is classified," Cole replied. "It was part of a government program and must be returned immediately for reassignment. You were not authorized to keep it." Jack met the man's gaze, calm but unmoving. "You have paperwork for that." Cole hesitated, the faintest pause betraying expectation of compliance. "Orders are sealed. Retrieval is under Section 12. You can verify through federal channels if you wish." Jack shook his head. "That's not how it works. I've seen Section 12 authorizations. They come with a written directive and a signature from an operations commander. Unless you have that, this is a welfare check, not a seizure. The agents exchanged a look. Myers stepped forward, lowering his voice. Mr. Turner, this is a matter of national security. The dog's presence here poses a potential threat. The only threat I've seen lately is people showing up uninvited, Jack said quietly. You want the dog? Bring a warrant. Cole's jaw tightened. That's your final position. It's the only one I've got, Jack replied. The taller man studied him for another moment, then gave a small nod. You'll regret making this difficult, he said simply. They turned, walked to the car, and drove away without another word. Jack watched until the vehicle vanished down the tree line, the sound of the engine fading into the wind. He closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of what had just crossed his threshold. Rex stood near the window tail, low but steady eyes fixed on the path the car had taken. Looks like they found you, Jack murmured, and they want you back. He spent the rest of the day trying to think through possibilities, whether the men were genuine agents or something else. He called Captain Ross, but the line went straight to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. By dusk, clouds had gathered thick and heavy. The temperature dropped the air, biting through the seams of the cabin. Jack added wood to the stove and double-checked the locks again. Rex paced near the door, uneasy nose twitching at every draft. You feel it too, Jack said softly. He tried to work on his notes, but concentration drifted like smoke. When the wind began to rise, he decided to turn in early. The storm came fast, the kind that moved without warning in the Montana backcountry. Snow struck the windows in sheets. Jack slept lightly, half listening for sounds that didn't belong. Sometime past midnight, a sharp crack cut through the storm, the unmistakable splinter of wood under force. Rex was on his feet, instantly, a low growl rolling through the dark. Jack reached for the revolver on the nightstand. Stay, he whispered, though the word felt futile. Another sound followed, this one, softer footsteps inside the kitchen. He moved toward the hallway, gun raised, breath held. A shadow crossed the thin line of light from the stove, slow and deliberate. Before Jack could react, Rex lunged, intercepting the figure as it stepped forward. The collision threw both against the table, sending it crashing to the floor. Jack caught only a glimpse, a black mask, a gloved hand reaching for a weapon before Rex drove the man backward, snarling low. A second shadow appeared by the window, another intruder climbing in. Jack fired once, the sound deafening in the small room. The second man ducked the bullet, hitting the frame. Move, Rex, Jack shouted, but the dog already had. He seized Jack's sleeve and tugged hard, not in panic, but with direction. The motion was so precise, so determined, that Jack didn't question it. Smoke from the gun and the cold from the open door mixed into a choking haze. Rex pulled him toward the back, out through the storage room and into the storm. The air outside was a wall of white snow blinding under the moonlight. Jack stumbled, half-dragged, boots slipping. Behind them, the cabin lights flickered, then went dark. A muffled explosion of wood echoed the front door, kicked in again. Go, boy, Jack urged, but Rex didn't need prompting. He moved through the drifts with a confidence that defied the storm, every turn chosen with purpose. Jack followed, trusting the dog's path over his own instincts. The snow swallowed sound except for their breathing and the wind. They climbed toward the ridge behind the cabin, the one that overlooked the valley. Jack risked a glance back. The cabin below was a blur of shadow and light figures moving with flashlights. Whoever they were organized. Rex paused once, testing the air, then veered left into a thicket. Jack followed close branches, whipping his shoulders. After what felt like forever, the terrain leveled. Ahead through the trees, a faint outline appeared, the old ranger shelter from decades ago, little more than a shack, but still standing. Rex led him straight to it, stopping at the door and pawing once. Jack opened it, half expecting collapse, but the inside was dry enough, the air still. He shut the door behind them and leaned against it, listening. Nothing but the storm. Rex circled once, then lay down near the wall, chest heaving but steady. Jack knelt beside him, placing a hand on his neck. "You knew where to go," he said quietly. The dog's ears flicked in acknowledgement. Jack stared at him, realization dawning. "You were trained for this two-evasion survival." He rubbed his face, exhaustion pressing hard now that the adrenaline faded. Through the cracks in the boards, he could see faint lights down in the valley moving where the cabin stood. They were searching. "We can't go back," Jack murmured. "Not tonight." He reached into his coat, found the folded notebook still safe in the inner pocket, the pages holding the only record of what he knew so far. Rex rested his head on Jack's boot, a silent vow of watchfulness. Outside, the storm raged on, erasing tracks, burying everything that had happened beneath a fresh layer of snow. The cabin, the files, the evidence, they were all gone or soon would be. But what they had couldn't be erased so easily. The storm finally began to ease just before dawn. The old ranger cabin creaked under its own age, but it held. Jack Turner sat on the floor against the wall, revolver in hand, exhaustion weighing him down more than fear. Beside him, Rex dozed lightly, every breath visible in the cold air. Jack could see the faint outlines of the valley through the cracks in the wood, but the cabin below their home was nothing but a white blur, now swallowed by snow. Whoever had come for them would assume they were dead or lost. That thought should have comforted him, but it didn't. He had learned that people who wanted things buried didn't stop digging. By mid-morning, when the wind finally calmed, Jack stood and looked around the small cabin. It had been abandoned for decades. Old ranger logs were stacked in a crate, their ink faded, a lantern hung crooked from a rusted nail. He kicked some snow off the threshold and started a small fire in the stone hearth with a handful of matches he found in his coat. The warmth crept slowly into the space. Rex lifted his head eyes, following every move. "You did good last night," Jack said quietly. "You saved us." The dog blinked once, head resting back on his paws, content but alert. Jack couldn't rest. The questions pressed too hard. Why had Rex led him here of all places? The ranger post was nearly forgotten, but maybe not to Rex. He noticed the dog sniffing the corners of the room, moving with that deliberate precision that always signaled purpose. Jack watched as Rex stopped near a section of wall beside the old desk, nose pressed to the floorboard's tail still. The dog pawed once, then twice. "What is it?" Jack asked, crouching beside him. He saw a small seam in the wood, a faint line that didn't match the grain. He pried at it with the blade of his pocket knife until a board came loose, revealing a shallow compartment filled with dust and the faint smell of engine oil. Inside was a metal box no bigger than a book, its latch corroded, but intact. Jack lifted it out carefully and opened it. Inside lay a small hard drive wrapped in plastic marked with faded letters. IOTG 47 Audio Evidence 1487. His heart stopped for a moment. "You found this?" he whispered, staring at Rex. "You were trained to." He connected the drive to the small laptop he'd carried in his pack. The screen flickered, the device struggling to read after so many years, then finally opened a single folder labeled March 14th. Jack clicked it. A burst of static filled the cabin, then a voice unmistakably. Mike's. His partner's voice, alive and breathing before the explosion. "We've got the files, but Harris doesn't want this logged. Says it's above clearance. Feels wrong, Jack. If this goes sideways, someone's going to get blamed. I'm keeping a copy, not for me, for insurance. Rex is backing up the trace right now." Jack froze. The audio continued with the faint hum of machinery and a distant door closing. Then another voice entered low and measured Harris. "You were told to log the material, Sergeant. There is no insurance here. Delete it and walk away." The file cut off in a burst of static. Jack sat back staring at the screen, the air in the cabin suddenly too thin. The recording was short, but it was enough to prove everything. The explosion wasn't an accident. It was a cleanup. Harris had known. He'd ordered it. Rex had been part of the evidence trace, and when the blast happened, someone must have recovered him later, erased his identity, and buried the rest. Jack ran his hand down Rex's neck, feeling the scar again. You carried the proof, didn't you? You brought me back here because you remembered. The dog's eyes met his, calm, unblinking. You never forgot. Jack closed the laptop and slid the drive into his pocket. He needed to get it to someone he could trust, and that list was painfully short. He turned on his satellite phone, waited for the signal, and called Captain Ross. The connection crackled through static before a tired voice answered. Jack, where are you? In the hills north of town, Jack said. I found something. It's about Harris. I have proof and audio log from the night of the explosion. The line went quiet. Then Ross said, You sure about that? I heard Mike's voice. Jack replied. And Harris's. They were covering something up. I can't hold on to this. I need to hand it off. All right, Ross said slowly. There's a safe point near the old highway depot. I can meet you there in 2 hours. Just don't use your truck. They'll trace it. Copy that. Jack ended the call and looked at Rex. You ready to move? The dog stood instantly, tail low, posture alert. Jack packed the laptop, the drive, and a few supplies, then doused the fire. They left the cabin and started down the ridge. The air was clear now, but heavy with that strange stillness that follows storms. Snow crunched underfoot, each sound too loud. They reached the tree line just as the clouds began to shift. The road below lay quiet, a white ribbon across the valley. Jack scanned it once before descending. Halfway down, Rex stopped. The fur along his back lifted a growl rising deep in his chest. Jack followed his gaze, a flash of movement near the cabin they had left behind. Then, in the distance, headlights, a black SUV climbing the hill fast. No, Jack whispered. Not now. He broke into a run, Rex keeping pace beside him. They reached the truck he had hidden under a tarp near the stream, jumped in, and started the engine. The tires bit into snow, throwing up powder. The SUV appeared behind them, gaining ground. Jack pushed the accelerator, the road twisting through the valley like a white serpent. Bullets cracked against the rear glass. Down he shouted, though Rex already was crouched low between the seats. Jack fired twice through the open window, forcing the SUV to swerve. The road narrowed ahead near a bend lined with pines. Another shot came hitting the side mirror. Jack veered hard into the trees, tires skidding the truck, jolting over roots and drifts. The SUV followed lights cutting through branches. A figure leaned from the passenger side window, weapon drawn. Jack aimed, but too late, the muzzle flash lit the snow like lightning. Rex leapt before Jack could react, pushing off the seat, intercepting the shot meant for him. The sound was sharp final. The dog hit the ground hard, a dark stain spreading against white snow. Jack slammed the brakes, heart crashing into his ribs. He fired again, forcing the SUV back. It spun, clipped a tree, and stopped. Jack rushed to Rex's side, dropping to his knees. Stay with me, he said, voice shaking. The dog's breath came in shallow bursts, eyes still fixed on him, loyal even in pain. Jack pressed his hand over the wound, feeling warmth against the cold. You're going to be all right, he whispered, though he knew the words were a prayer, not a promise. The SUV's doors opened in the distance, figures moving through the smoke and snow. Jack lifted Rex in his arms, blood staining his coat, and stumbled toward the forest. Behind him, the past he'd unearthed was closing in fast, and the only thing standing between him and it was a dog who had already given everything once before. The forest was still when Jack Turner reached the base of the ridge, Rex limp in his arms. Dawn light filtered through the trees, silver and quiet, as if the world itself held its breath. Jack's boots left a red trail on the snow that the wind was already beginning to erase. He stumbled toward an old ranger road where he knew a signal might reach. Kneeling behind a fallen pine, he pressed his coat against Rex's wound, whispering words of comfort that trembled in the cold air. The dog's breathing was faint but steady, his eyes half open. Jack pulled out his phone and hit the emergency channel. "Ross, it's Turner," he said, voice hoarse. "We've been hit. I've got the evidence, but they found us. Rex is down." The answer came through static, clipped and urgent. "Hold your position. We've got your coordinates. Help's on the way." Jack held the phone against his ear until the battery died. Then he stayed there, holding Rex, counting each breath as though willing them to continue. When the rescue team arrived an hour later, the helicopter's blades tore through the quiet, scattering snow like ghosts. Medics rushed in, lifting Rex carefully onto a stretcher. Jack climbed in beside him, refusing to let go. Through the noise and wind, he whispered, "Hang on, partner. You're not done yet." 3 days later, in a sterile room at the regional veterinary hospital, Rex stirred under the soft hum of machines. Jack sat beside him, his arm in a sling from the firefight, but his eyes fixed on the dog. The vet, Dr. Linda Hayes, entered quietly. "He's tough," she said. The bullet missed the lung by half an inch. "He'll walk again, maybe even run if he gets rest." Jack nodded the relief so strong it left him dizzy. "He's earned all the rest he wants." She smiled. "You both have." The investigation unfolded faster than anyone expected. Captain Ross had delivered the hard drive to Internal Affairs the same night, and within 48 hours the recordings went federal. The voices on the file were authenticated Mike's report and Harris's order to delete the evidence. Subpoenas followed arrests came quietly at dawn. Harris and 2 officers from the old task group were taken into custody on charges of obstruction, falsification of records, and conspiracy. The Bureau called it a long overdue correction of record. Jack called it justice, though the word felt too small. By the time Rex was released from the hospital, winter had begun to thaw into spring. The press had already found the story, "Ex-cop and his dog unearth buried case," one headline read. Another called, "Rex the dog who solved a case the police buried." Jack tried not to read them, but the town was small, and even the grocery clerk mentioned it when he came in for coffee beans. People nodded to him now instead of looking away. Some even thanked him. He appreciated the kindness, but kept his replies short. For him, the story wasn't about headlines or vindication. It was about one voice on an old recording, Mike's finally being heard. Rex recovered quickly. The scar along his side faded to a faint line beneath the thick black fur. He moved a little slower at first, but the spark was still there, that watchful intelligence in his amber eyes. Jack brought him back to the cabin, rebuilt the door, replaced the shattered window panes, and patched the holes in the floor. Life settled again into rhythm, the morning walks along the ridge, the soft crack of wood in the stove, the quiet companionship that needed no words. A month after the trial, 2 men in uniform came up the dirt road in another black SUV, this time unarmed and polite. Jack met them on the porch, coffee steaming in his hand. Mr. Turner, the older one, began. "I'm Major Collins with the Federal Canine Rehabilitation Division. We wanted to discuss Rex." Jack's body tensed. "He's not up for discussion." The man smiled carefully. "Not exactly. The department's records show that Rex 47 was decommissioned due to injury. Given his performance and his role in your case, command would like to reintroduce him to the active program. With proper retraining, he could be invaluable again." Jack looked down at the dog lying at his feet, head resting on one paw, eyes half closed. "He's done more than enough," Jack said. "He's not going back in a cage or under anyone's orders again." The younger officer spoke up gently. "There's an adoption protocol, sir. If you want to make it permanent, you just have to sign." Jack took the clipboard, glanced at the form, and without hesitation signed his name in firm strokes. "He's home," he said simply. That night, after the officials left, Jack sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The air smelled of pine and thawing earth. Rex lay beside him, tail flicking lazily against the boards. The valley below was quiet, peaceful, in a way Jack had almost forgotten existed. He reached down, running his hand through the thick fur behind Rex's ears. "You know," he said softly, "they called you a hero." The dog tilted his head, listening. "But you were more than that. You were the only one who never gave up." Rex huffed softly, resting his chin on Jack's boot. Weeks turned into months. The story faded from headlines, replaced by newer news. Harris pleaded guilty, sparing the families another trial. Jack received an official letter restoring his rank and commendation, though he left it unopened on the desk. He had no desire to return. His war, both in uniform and in conscience, was finally over. Instead, he poured his days into repairing the trails around the property, helping the local sheriff with the occasional search and rescue call, and spending every quiet evening with Rex by the fire. Sometimes when the moon rose full and the wind moved through the trees just right, Rex would lift his head and let out a low, calm howl, not of longing but remembrance. Jack would listen, the sound threading through the night like an echo of all they'd endured. One morning in early summer, Jack woke to the soft sound of paws on the porch. Rex was sitting by the open door watching the valley. Birds called from the tree line, the kind of chorus that only comes when the world is at peace. Jack poured coffee and joined him, the mug warm in his hands. "You think we did all right?" he asked. The dog glanced at him, eyes bright in the morning light, and nudged his leg gently. Jack smiled. "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." They stayed there a long while, man and dog, guardians of their small corner of the world. Beyond the mountains, the world moved on, louder, faster, full of noise. But here the air was clean, the silence kind. Rex's tail thumped once, slow and steady, and Jack leaned back in his chair, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Peace earned, not given. The storm that had brought them together was long past, but its lesson remained that loyalty could outlast fear, that truth could survive being buried, and that sometimes salvation came on 4 legs and a quiet heart. If this story moved you, take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps us bring more true-hearted stories to life. What part of Jack and Rex's journey struck you most the moment they met in the storm, or when the truth finally came to light? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you think loyalty really means. We read every story you share.